Medieval warfare is often remembered through stories of knights in shining armor and heroic victories. But the reality for most soldiers was far darker. Wounds were not just about blood and steel on the battlefield. They were about infection, crude surgery, broken bodies, and the silent suffering that followed men long after the fighting was done. From training accidents that left scars before a soldier ever saw combat, to brutal battlefield injuries and the harsh neglect of common infantry, the lives of the wounded reveal a side of history rarely told. This is the brutal truth about wounded medieval soldiers. You won't believe how much pain and hardship was hidden behind the myths of chivalry and glory. Number 1. Training wounds before the battle. Long before steel met flesh in real combat, bodies were already paying a price. Drill yards produced their own casualties. Splinters from pell posts lodged in palms, knuckles split open by blunted edges, and wrists sprained from hours of cutting drills with practice swords that were heavier than they looked. Squires learned the lance against the quinton, and when the counterweight whipped back, it punched shoulders and ribs hard enough to bruise for weeks. A mistimed couching jarred the collarbone and neck, leaving headaches that lingered through the season. Jousting practice multiplied the risk falls from the saddle, stunned riders inside their helmets, while a broken lance drove shock through the arms and into the spine, the kind of impact that never quite let the back forget. Wrestling and dagger play, standard parts of knightly training, meant jammed fingers, torn ligaments, and noses broken on hard-packed earth. Archery ranges carried their own quiet damage. Repetitive draws carved deep grooves in shoulders and upper backs, and swollen fingers told on longbowmen even when the bowstring wasn't singing. Chainmail and padded gambesons saved lives, but rubbed raw at the neck and under the arms. Sweat and grit trapped under fabric raised rashes that turned to infections if left to fester on campaign. Shields hammered the forearm with every parry, so bone-deep bruises collected along the ulna. The hand behind the boss went numb after a day's work, and sometimes stayed that way. Poorly fitted helms bit into the brow and pinched the jaw, turning long drills into a test of pain tolerance. A shifted visor narrowed vision just enough to invite an accidental strike from a sparring partner. Horses added their share, saddle rubs, crushed toes in the stable, and the occasional kick that ended a future on the field before it began. None of this earned glory. It was the slow grind of preparation scar tissue forming in elbows, stiffness setting into hips, and a constant calculation of what hurt enough to rest versus what had to be ignored to keep pace with the yardmaster's bark. Number 2. The armor that wounded its wearer. Armor in the Middle Ages was never a simple shield against danger. It was also a source of pain and long-term harm for the men who wore it. Chainmail, made from thousands of interlinked rings, weighed anywhere from 10 to 20 kilograms and pressed constantly into the shoulders and back. When worn for days on campaign, it rubbed raw spots under the arms, across the chest, and along the neck. Sweat and grit worked their way under the fabric lining, producing sores that often turned septic. Soldiers tried to pad their armor with linen or wool, but constant friction still cut into the skin. Plate armor, which appeared in the later Middle Ages, distributed weight more evenly, yet still placed enormous strain on the hips, lower back, and knees. Prolonged marches left men limping, their joints swollen from carrying an extra 25 to 35 kilograms of metal alongside weapons and supplies. The problem grew worse in hot climates. A knight sealed inside a steel harness under the summer sun could find his body overheating within minutes. Chroniclers recorded cases of men collapsing during tournaments or battles not from wounds but from exhaustion and heat stroke, sometimes suffocating inside helmets that trapped heat and sweat. Helmets themselves carried their own risks. While they guarded the skull, they restricted hearing and narrowed vision, turning the battlefield into a blur of muffled noise and narrow sight lines. In the crush of melee combat, soldiers often stumbled into blows they never saw coming. Even without a blade breaking through, blunt trauma seeped through the armor. A mace strike or warhammer blow could dent steel inward, cracking ribs, crushing collarbones, or causing concussions that lingered long after the fight. Many knights removed their gear at day's end only to find their bodies mapped with purple bruises, sprains, or even fractures hidden under the rush of adrenaline. Prolonged use left its mark too. Spinal compression, chronic back pain, and permanently damaged joints plagued veterans who had carried armor through years of campaigning. In this way, the very technology meant to protect medieval warriors slowly dismantled their bodies from within, leaving them scarred not just by the enemy, but by the tools of their own defense. Number 3. The fear that lingered. Fear did not end when the trumpets fell silent. It calcified into habits of body and mind that followed soldiers for years. Accounts from monastic scribes and household records point to veterans who startled at loud noises, avoided crowded markets, and woke gasping from sleep, describing visitations and crushing weight in the night that physicians framed as melancholia or an imbalance of black bile. The intellectual tools of the period translated shock into spiritual and humoral language. Acedia for listlessness that ruined prayer and work, choleric excess for sudden rages that spilled into alehouse fights, and evil dreams interpreted as demonic temptation rather than recurring memories of slaughter. Campaign styles amplified the damage. Chevauchés that burned villages forced levied peasants into acts that clashed with parish teaching, leaving a moral wound visible later in long confessions, generous almsgiving, and endowments for masses of the dead. Head injuries from blunt weapons and falls added a layer of invisible impairment concussions that dulled concentration, altered mood, and made temper harder to govern, which contemporaries folded into talk of weak will or sinful anger. Knightly advice literature admitted that courage coexisted with terror. Manuals that praised steadfastness also acknowledged the quaking limbs and dry mouth before a charge, a physiology that, when repeated across seasons of war, hardened into tremor and chronic vigilance. Crusaders returning from long marches across unfamiliar climates showed the toll of dehydration, sleepless bivouacs, and constant ambush risk. Chaplains noted penances stretched over years, pilgrimages to shrines for peace of mind as much as for healing of flesh. Within garrisons, comrades recognized patterns without naming them. The veteran who kept his back to the wall in hall and church, the archer who refused to sleep near the door, the man-at-arms who cleaned gear at night because quiet daylight felt dangerous. Ole and strong wine served as common self-medication, numbing jolts of memory, but feeding quarrels that dotted manor court rolls with fines for brawling. Some sought enclosure instead, entering religious houses where routine, silence, and psalms offered structure. Others drifted into free companies where violence felt familiar and fear could be managed by ritual tightening straps, counting arrows, checking the edge one more time. No medical category captured these patterns, yet they were legible in the era's own terms: disordered humors, troubled conscience, and the shadow of sin. The mind of the wounded soldier remained a contested field. Its skirmishes fought in sleeplessness, penance, and the small strategies of staying alive after the battle was already over. Number 4. The struggle of prisoners. For soldiers who fell into enemy hands, the ordeal rarely ended with the wound itself. The fate of a prisoner depended heavily on social rank, wealth, and the captor's intentions. Nobles and knights were valuable because ransom was an established practice across Europe, especially after the 12th century. A captured knight might be treated decently while his family or lord negotiated his release, though decent often meant only that he was not starved to death. For ordinary infantrymen, however, survival was far less likely. A wounded commoner, too poor to bring ransom, was often abandoned, executed, or kept in miserable conditions until he succumbed to his injuries. Conditions of captivity were notoriously harsh. Medieval prisons were not designed for medical care. They were simply holding spaces, often dungeons below castles or makeshift wooden cages near camps. Damp air, poor ventilation, and lack of sanitation turned small wounds into festering infections. Soldiers chained together shared lice and fleas, while rats thrived in piles of waste and spoiled food. Wounds that might have been survivable with basic cleaning became lethal when bandages rotted against the skin. Malnutrition was another killer. Captors had little incentive to feed prisoners well, and weak bodies could not fight off infections. Surviving records mention men reduced to skeletal figures, barely able to stand when exchanges or releases finally came. There was also the deliberate cruelty inflicted as a tool of psychological warfare. Chronicles describe mutilations carried out to terrify enemies, cutting off noses, ears, or hands to send survivors back as living warnings. These acts were meant to dishonor, to mark men permanently as defeated. For peasants whose social standing was already fragile, such scars condemned them to marginal lives on the edge of their communities. Nobles might hide injuries behind heraldic honor, but common soldiers bore their disfigurements without protection or sympathy. Some prisoners were sold into slavery rather than ransomed or killed. Captured crusaders, for example, could be marched across markets in the Levant and forced into years of servitude. Others were pressed into labor by their captors, made to dig fortifications or carry supplies while their wounds healed poorly or not at all. What emerges from chronicles, legal records, and accounts of war is a picture of captivity as an extension of battle, a prolonged erosion of the body through hunger, infection, humiliation, and forced endurance. To survive meant not only resisting the enemy's sword, but also withstanding months or even years of neglect, cruelty, and the slow decay of untreated wounds. Number 5. The Crusader's Burden. Campaigns in the Holy Land exposed soldiers to an entirely different world of suffering, where wounds were not limited to the clash of sword and spear, but extended to the landscape itself. Marching across the Levantine deserts turned armor into a furnace, heating the steel until it burned the skin beneath. Even small scratches became dangerous as sweat, dust, and heat transformed them into infected sores. Chroniclers describe columns of crusaders collapsing from sunstroke long before reaching a battlefield, their lips cracked and bodies weakened by constant thirst. Dehydration was as deadly as any enemy cavalry charge. Camps became breeding grounds for disease. Dysentery spread through contaminated water. Fevers swept through tents, and outbreaks of plague decimated ranks without a single blow exchanged. Historians estimate that more crusaders died from illness than combat, showing how unrelenting the environment truly was. For those actually wounded in battle, survival depended not only on luck, but on cultural choices. Many crusaders encountered local healing practices that were more advanced than those of Europe. Arab physicians used antiseptic herbs, poultices to draw out infection, and techniques like cauterization, carried out with greater precision than European barber surgeons. Some remedies offered genuine relief, reducing fevers or preventing wounds from festering. Yet prejudice and religious suspicion often stopped crusaders from accepting such help. To rely on Muslim doctors was sometimes seen as weakness or even betrayal, so many men refused treatment that might have saved their lives. This tension between pride and survival left countless warriors lingering with untreated injuries. Long marches combined with sudden ambushes and brutal sieges meant that nearly every crusader carried scars, both visible and hidden. A sword slash or arrow wound was only part of the ordeal. The endless fatigue, poor diet, and lack of proper rest eroded the body further. There was no safe village nearby to retreat to, no family home to recover in. An injury in these campaigns often meant being left behind on foreign soil, surrounded by strangers or enemies, dying far from the lands that had sent them. Even survivors bore the burden for the rest of their lives, their bodies shaped by infection, their memories marked by the endless desert heat and the loneliness of a war that demanded more than steel and strength. It consumed the very endurance of the human body. Number 6. Logistics of pain. The reality of medieval campaigning was that soldiers carried their suffering with them every step of the way, even far from the battlefield. The process of moving large feudal armies created an environment where injuries multiplied without a single arrow or sword being drawn. Long marches in poorly constructed boots led to blisters that split open, quickly becoming infected in an age without antiseptics. Men forced to walk for weeks developed swollen joints and chronic tendon damage, while those mounted risked broken bones when horses stumbled on uneven ground or slipped in mud. Cavalry accidents could crush a soldier beneath hundreds of kilograms of horse and armor, crippling him before the enemy was even in sight. Life in camp brought its own hazards. Cooking fires caused burns when tents collapsed in high winds, or when boiling water tipped over onto men crowded too close. Accidents with weapons during training or careless handling in cramped conditions produced gashes and puncture wounds, leaving soldiers weakened before combat. Camps were often overcrowded and filthy. Lice and fleas spread through bedding, carrying typhus and other fevers that left soldiers unable to fight. Malnutrition worsened everything. Armies frequently marched without consistent food supplies, eating spoiled bread or rancid meat. Lack of proper nutrition weakened immune systems, turning minor cuts into lingering infections and leaving bodies unable to recover from injuries that otherwise might have healed. The continuous movement of medieval campaigns gave little opportunity for proper care. Soldiers often marched with dirty bandages wrapped around open wounds, with no chance to clean or replace them. Water used for drinking was scarce, and it was rarely wasted on medical hygiene. Men slept in damp clothing, allowing wounds to fester overnight, and when campaigns stretched across months, many soldiers carried untreated injuries into subsequent battles. It was not unusual for men to fight already limping, half blind from untreated eye infections, or coughing from fevers contracted in camp. These conditions blurred the line between battle casualties and the gradual wearing down of the body by daily hardship. The logistics of medieval warfare created a slow erosion of human strength. The burden of carrying armor, weapons, and provisions while marching through hostile terrain compounded old injuries and ensured that even before swords were crossed, many men were already weakened, scarred, or permanently impaired. War was not a single decisive moment of violence, but an accumulation of physical decline, where every mile marched and every night in camp brought its own share of wounds. Number 7. Strange remedies and battlefield superstitions. The wounded body of a medieval soldier was often subjected to treatments that combined fragments of medical knowledge with deep layers of folklore, religion, and sheer desperation. Soldiers and surgeons alike reached for whatever materials they believed might turn the tide between life and death, often guided as much by superstition as by observation. In many cases, battlefield soil itself was used in treatment. Rubbing earth into wounds was thought to reconnect the body with the land and somehow seal the injury. While this frequently worsened infections, it illustrates how closely healing was tied to symbolic acts. Amulets, holy relics, and charms stitched into clothing were carried with equal seriousness. Men trusted a saint's bone or a cross to keep wounds from festering more than they trusted a surgeon's knife. Folk remedies were widespread, passed down orally through generations. Animal fat was smeared on burns or gashes as a protective layer, though it often trapped dirt and bacteria. Moldy bread, surprisingly, occasionally provided unintended benefit, since certain molds contained natural antibiotic properties that slowed infection, though medieval healers had no understanding of microbes. Crushed insects, such as ants or worms, were applied in poultices, sometimes because their appearance or behavior was symbolically linked to healing. Leeching and bloodletting remained central practices. Physicians believed that imbalances of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were the root of illness. By draining blood, they hoped to restore balance, even when it left a wounded man dangerously weak. Prayer and ritual framed nearly every act of treatment. Surgeons muttered blessings before cutting, and soldiers recited psalms while enduring cauterization or stitching. Some believed that saying the right words while binding a wound could ward off infection or bleeding. Religious healing shrines and pilgrimages were recommended for chronic injuries, especially when conventional remedies failed. In crusader campaigns, contact with Middle Eastern medical traditions introduced new remedies: herbal poultices, cooling salves, and distilled plant extracts. But acceptance was uneven, as prejudice often outweighed practicality. Ultimately, the remedies reveal not only the limitations of medieval medical understanding, but also the resilience of belief in the face of pain. For many, survival was explained less by the crude stitches or searing hot iron than by faith that a relic had shielded them, or a prayer had been answered. The battlefield was thus not only a test of steel, but also of conviction, where men placed their trust as much in the unseen world of spirits and saints as in the hands of their healers. Number 8. Forgotten soldiers of the feudal army. Behind the shining image of armored knights stood the true bulk of medieval armies: Ordinary peasants pulled from their fields and forced into campaigns that offered little reward and enormous risk. Unlike nobles, these men had almost no protection. At best, they wore padded cloth or a leather jerkin, which offered minimal resistance against arrows, crossbow bolts, or sword strikes. Their weapons were often simple farming tools adapted for war. Spears with poorly forged heads, wooden staves, or rusted blades that broke easily. This lack of equipment made wounds catastrophic. A slash that a knight's armor might deflect could slice deep into a peasant's unprotected body, leaving crippling injuries. Cavalry charges were especially brutal. Horses barreled through infantry ranks, trampling those who couldn't escape in time, breaking legs, spines, and ribs. Survivors frequently carried permanent disabilities, and without wealth or influence, few had access to surgeons who might save them. The medical attention peasants received was usually limited to whatever comrades or local camp followers could provide. Clean cloth was scarce, and most wounds were simply wrapped in rags or left open. Infection was almost inevitable. When peasants survived, it was often through sheer resilience, but survival came at a heavy cost. A man who returned home, missing fingers, blinded in one eye, or crippled by a limp, could no longer work the fields as before. Families of wounded soldiers fell into hardship, their harvests diminished, and starvation loomed over households already strained by war taxes. While knights could fall back on estates, ransoms, or pensions from their lords, peasants had nothing but their labor, and once their bodies were broken, their futures were stripped away. Chroniclers of the Middle Ages rarely mentioned these men. The grand narratives of battles and crusades focused on nobles, commanders, and chivalric deeds, while the stories of common infantry vanished in silence. Yet without them, armies could not have marched or sieges been sustained. They carried supplies, dug trenches, and fought on the front lines. The true weight of war rested on their shoulders, but history recorded only their absence. Their scars and lost limbs became invisible reminders in villages across Europe, shaping families and communities long after the battles ended. The brutal truth is that medieval warfare consumed these forgotten soldiers as expendable resources, leaving countless nameless men to return broken or not at all, their struggles erased from the heroic image of knights in shining armor.